It's not about the clothes or what's underneath them, but the truth we share when we're vulnerable. Let's take a moment to connect with our emotions and thoughts before we let anything else take the lead. There's a depth to every person that goes beyond the physical. Before we explore the rest, let's take a step back and really listen to the thoughts and feelings that guide us. In every connection, the true magic lies in the unspoken. Before we make any moves, let's connect emotionally on a deeper level so that everything else becomes that much more meaningful. Before we explore the physical, let's explore the emotional landscape of who we are. The thoughts and feelings that we sometimes keep hidden are what truly matter, and they deserve to be seen first. What's beneath the surface isn't just skin, it's a world of emotions, memories, and experiences. Before we take off the layers, let's first explore what's really inside. True closeness comes from understanding each other's thoughts and feelings, not just the body. Let's share what's on our minds before we share anything else. Before we explore anything physical, let's first talk about the emotional energy that's building between us. The connection we create in those moments of honesty is what really lasts. There's a quiet intimacy that happens when we're open with our feelings before we explore what's physical. Let's take that first step into the hearts of one another before we go any further. Emotional intimacy doesn't have to wait for the physical. Let's peel back the layers of our hearts and minds, sharing what we've been holding on to before we go any further. Before we get to the physical, let's take a moment to acknowledge the emotional space we're in. What are we really feeling? What do we really want from this? Let's speak our truth first. True connection starts with understanding each other's deepest thoughts and emotions. Before we explore anything else, let's take a moment to connect on a mental and emotional level. The first step to intimacy is emotional honesty. Before we do anything else, let's lay down the walls and talk about what's on our hearts and minds. Before the clothes come off, let's share the feelings that truly define us. The stories we've lived, the emotions we've carried, and the truths we've kept hidden. These are the things that make us who we are. It's easy to focus on the physical, but the true magic lies in the mental and emotional connection we form first. Let's nurture that before anything else happens. Before we explore the physical, let's take a moment to breathe and tune into our feelings. What do we need? What do we desire? These are the questions that matter most before we go any further. What's beneath the surface often speaks louder than what's visible. Let's explore the thoughts and emotions that shape us before we focus on anything else. Before we move forward, let's take a deep dive into the emotional connection we're building. What do we want from each other, and what do we need to say? Let's begin there. It's the emotional exchange that sets the tone for everything else. Before anything physical, let's explore what's truly on our minds and hearts. Intimacy doesn't begin with the body, it begins with the mind and the heart. Let's share the unspoken feelings and thoughts that will guide us before we proceed. Before we take off any layers, let's get real with each other. Let's talk about our fears, our desires, and everything that's been left unspoken. Sometimes it's not just about shedding our clothes, but shedding our defenses. Before we do anything else, let's connect on a deeper level, where our true selves can come alive. Before we explore the physical, let's explore what's hidden beneath the surface. What are the emotions we rarely express? Let's connect on that level first. True connection is born from vulnerability, from sharing the things that matter most. Before anything physical, let's share what's on our minds and in our hearts. Before we take this step, let's first be honest with ourselves and each other. The emotional and mental intimacy we share will make everything else feel that much more significant. Intimacy is more than just physical. It's the bond we create through our thoughts, our feelings, and our openness. Let's honor that before anything else. Before we take off any clothes, let's first take off our walls. Let's share what's real, what's raw, and what's true. What's truly intimate is not what we take off physically, but what we open up to emotionally. Let's create that connection first. The clothes might come off, but the connection comes from what we're willing to share emotionally. Let's start there before we move any further. True vulnerability is the foundation of real connection. Before we dive into the physical, let's get real with each other about what's truly on our minds. Before we explore what's beneath the surface, let's take a moment to understand the depth of what's truly hidden. What we wear often tells the world a story, but what we carry inside speaks louder. Let's talk about what we've been through, who we've become, and what we truly need from one another. In the quiet moments before the layers come off, it's important to remember that intimacy isn't just about physical proximity, but the emotional distance we've traveled together. It's not just about the clothes we shed, but the walls that we tear down in trust. The real connection happens before we remove anything. It's in the vulnerability of sharing our unspoken thoughts, the parts of us we often hide, and the fears we rarely voice. Let's honor that before anything else. What we take off physically is often a reflection of what we're ready to reveal emotionally. Let's get to the heart of it, the feelings and thoughts that we sometimes keep covered before we do anything else. Sometimes it's not the clothes that we need to shed, but the insecurities that we carry underneath. Before we do anything, let's talk about the things we're really afraid to say and the truths we're afraid to face. Before we venture into this moment together, let's strip away the expectations and pressures we've placed on ourselves. What we do together will be more meaningful if we first address the feelings that have been left unsaid for far too long. The real beauty lies in the stories we haven't shared, the emotions we haven't expressed, and the thoughts we've tucked away. Before we get to the physical, let's explore the deeper layers that deserve just as much attention. Before we take a step further, let's first acknowledge the space we're in emotionally. There's so much more to who we are than what meets the eye. Let's connect where it matters most, on a deeper level. True intimacy is born in the moments of honest conversation, in sharing what's real before we share anything physical. Before we dive into the next step, let's be open with our hearts and minds. What if we spent more time connecting emotionally, truly understanding the other's mind, before we focus on what's on the outside? Let's break down those emotional barriers first. Before we proceed with anything physical, let's take a deep breath and honor the emotional energy we're sharing. The mind and the heart deserve just as much attention as the body. The real thrill isn't just in the touch, but in the unspoken connection we create before we even get there. Let's take a moment to honor the emotions that are forming, the ones we sometimes forget to acknowledge. True connection begins with understanding each other's hearts. Let's talk about the things that matter most to us, the emotions that live beneath the surface, before we even consider the rest. There's something magical in the way we connect when we start with the soul, not just the body. Before we let go of anything, let's first connect with the energy that flows between us, the thoughts we sometimes keep to ourselves. It's easy to get lost in the physical, but the true beauty comes from the emotional intimacy that's built long before anything else happens. Let's connect on a deeper level, beyond just the surface. Before we focus on the physical connection, let's take a moment to reflect on the thoughts that linger in our minds. What do we really need from this? What do we want to give emotionally before anything else? Our bodies are just vessels for the energy we carry. Before we take anything off, let's first acknowledge the emotions and feelings we've hidden away from the world. Let's share those before we share anything else. The best moments are built on trust, understanding, and emotional connection. Let's peel back the layers of our thoughts and feelings before we ever think about what's under the surface. There's a rawness in vulnerability, a beauty in expressing the emotions that have been locked away. Before we share anything physical, let's first share our thoughts, our hearts, and the truth that lies within. Before we dive into the physical, let's explore the emotional depths that shape us. There's a world of thoughts and feelings we sometimes forget to acknowledge. Let's honor them first. True intimacy begins when we first recognize and acknowledge our shared emotions. It's not about what we look like, but about what we feel. Let's explore that before we explore anything else. Before the world sees our outer selves, let's first offer a glimpse into the hearts and minds that make us who we are. The connection we form starts long before anything physical happens. Before anything physical happens, let's open up about the things we've kept buried. Let's talk about the real stuff, the emotions that shape our actions and desires. Only then can we truly connect.